I first saw you at Pilgrim Pines at
Okay.
a pastor's retreat because we went out there for what did they call it?
Treehouse of Horrors. I don't know. It was
No, no, no. I don't know why they called it ashram, which
so my Treehouse of Horrors reminded you of Ashram.
I don't know why it clicked in my brain, but the thing is that's like beautiful, like just classic cultural appropriation, right? So we this in New Hampshire, like in the woods, we've got this ashram for evangelicals. I saw you out there and you looked like you do now, right? So you had the braided goatee
Yep.
and and okay, so Don, I know you now, so this description of you is going to be like, holy shit, I can't believe you thought this about me. I
I
was
can't
like,
wait.
I was like, okay, another one of these hipster guys that's like, even,
Yes.
like cool dudes for Jesus. Like,
Oh God.
so,
Evangel like an
well,
Evangel
you're an
even.
evangel, and like I had never seen a goatee like that, so I was like, okay, that's a little different. And everyone was talking about you, and that was it for me. It was like you looked cool, which was a strike against you for me, because I have all sorts of hangups about someone look.
I just could you repeat that? I didn't hear you. What did you say I looked?
Don, you look cool. You're a cool looking dude. So
Yes.
you looked cool, and people were talking about you, which made me think, oh, okay, I think I already solved who this guy is, right?
Right.
Which
Yeah.
is it's such a beautiful human thing that I do, and hopefully
We all do. I
hope
absolutely.
hopefully I'm not alone with that one. Um, but that was my first inclination about you, and then you actually were speaking that weekend because you were up from Virginia at the time. You were planting dust in, was it like Roanoke area?
Blacksburg, Virginia, just south of
Blacks
Roanoke.
okay,
Yeah.
Blacksburg, Virginia.
Yeah.
And what you talked about, I got to be honest, I don't remember, but
Me neither.
it was so like, oh, he's not that guy. I was like so impressed. I had to go up and talk to you, and like we didn't really become friends at that point. We became friendly more at one of the midwinter conferences maybe later on. But I was just like really enamored by what you were sharing because you started talking about the Jewishness of Jesus. You started focusing a
Mm,
lot. You were talking a lot about Torah and how illiterate we as evangelicals are about the Hebrew Bible. And that
yeah.
for me was perfect timing because I was so like, I think I get it and I don't like it anymore. Like I think I
Well,
get the
then you
whole
definitely got it. You definitely got it if you weren't liking it anymore. Yeah.
yeah, but like what you offered was so life-giving. And so
Mm.
I misjudged you per usual, which when I judge people that's the case. And and that was my first impression of you. There you go.
That's hilarious. Do you remember we were at an event in New York City, and
Yes.
I don't drive very often, and I rented a car and I left it run the whole night alongside the road because I didn't realize that you had to turn it off by pushing a button. And so here my car is sitting in New York City
Yes.
across from what looked like could have been a chop shop. I mean,
It
it
was.
was a car repair place, but I'm guessing it could have been a chop shop.
I think it was
And and I left the car run
all
the
night.
entire night, and we wouldn't have noticed it except for when we were walking by it the next morning to go back to the conference.
Yes.
I think someone was like, is that car running? And I
Yeah.
was like, oh no.
Oops. Oops, that's my car. That actually
Yeah.
reminds me,
Yeah.
that's when we became close. So that was the New City Conference. It was at Roosevelt Island. We were staying in
Yep.
like some part of New York City, and we stayed in the same hotel. And
Yeah.
I don't, we started, must have had, you must have both walked out of the music time, the music portion, which is what we always ended up, where we always ended up finding each other because
Right.
we just couldn't do the evangelical worship thing. And
No.
it was nice for me to find solidarity with someone because I always felt a little like, um, there must be something wrong with me that I can't handle this. I'm so cynical. It bothered me about myself. But then to find you out there, it was a lovely thing. So that brings back that memory too. Yeah, that's when we became closer. Thank
Yeah,
you,
I remember
evangelical.
that trip.
Thank you, evangelical worship, for bringing that this
Yes.
relationship together.
See, God works all things out for good.
I thought you were going to say God works in mysterious ways or everything happens for a reason, but
I mean, same thing. I
yeah.
mean, whatever. I plug in whatever cliche from church you want right there.
That's good. So Don Schiewer, the thing that drew me the most to the way that you approach the faith is that you use discipleship language. So when you talk
Yeah.
about people in your church, in the way that you talk about Christian community, use discipleship language. You don't say your people's pastor. You say someone you've discipled.
Yep.
Um, Now, I know I've walked through a little bit of that with you. Where does that thinking come from for you? And why is it that you feel like it's important now to use that language really intentionally?
Yeah. So I think a lot of that is kind of a reaction to the 100-mile wide, 1 inch deep evangelicalism that exists out there, right? That there are a lot of people that hold doctrinal views on how to think about God, how to think about the world, how to think about others, but really have no ability whatsoever to defend that view other than to ad hominem attacks or, well, the Bible says it and it's clear, or my pastor told me.
Mm,
And to me, that was never satisfying, ever. Even when I was in the midst of evangelicalism, I wanted to know why. I was that toddler all the way through adulthood that was like, why? And then get an answer, why? And then
yeah,
get an answer, and then why?
yeah.
And for me, I realized that I didn't have anybody that ever helped me understand why I believe what I believe.
Mm,
And so I was just a product of the church as opposed to a development of faith. And to me, that was really sad and
yeah,
disappointing.
yeah,
And I was left to fend for myself in bookstores and fend for myself in scholarly journals, whatever it might be. And so I went out and I started searching out why would I even want to believe these things?
right.
Because really many of them weren't compelling. Uh, and I found that most of the reasons that were argued for me to believe in something was fear of the outcome if I didn't.
Yes.
And I mean, I know you well enough, Dave, but I don't know about your audience, but that's just not a compelling reason,
No, no,
right? Fear
yeah,
is not a compelling reason to believe something.
no.
Fear works in urgent situations. Don't chase the ball out into the middle of the busy street. Fear works in that situation. To
Yes.
get someone to stop in the midst of an action, I think to use fear is appropriate. To yell when your child is reaching for a hot stove is an appropriate behavior in the midst of an action. That level of fear prior to the action being taken, or even after the action is taken, I find to be lacking any kind of sustainability,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Because it would be more important for a child to understand that something that is hot can burn them, as opposed to thinking that this one particular device in my kitchen has the ability to burn me. And then you have to relearn that over and over and over again.
That's really an interesting thing that just maybe clicked for me in a new way. That the language that we're brought up within evangelicalism is salvation.
Yep.
So you've been saved, which actually means like fear makes sense in that setting, right? If you're
If you're using salvation as an allegory of
right,
salvation from and Platonistic thinking of from from harm.
right. So you're saved from something, which is typically
Yes.
something harmful to you. But if you're talking about discipleship, there's
Yeah.
like a it's not fear based. It's a movement towards
It's
something.
wonder.
Yeah, it's participation,
Yeah.
rather than a rescue of something from outside of yourself. So
Yes.
I find that really interesting the way that you described how fear can be helpful to us. It makes sense because we are treated like toddlers the whole way through our evangelical experience.
except with a parent with cap locks stuck on, right? Like they're always yelling.
Right.
Right. Like that's how I experience evangelicalism, is that God is always yelling, like, stop, don't touch that, don't do this. And and myself as a parent, I haven't been the most spectacular parent, but I'd like to believe I'm at least average, is that, I found that the best results in parenting is those that are calm, those that are level-headed, those in which reason is used, that the child's question is taken seriously and welcomed even. And yet that was the opposite of my experience in faith, was that, Don, you asked too many questions.
Yeah.
Was always the thing. Like, stop asking. If you had enough faith, you wouldn't ask those questions. And I really upset the pastor of my childhood, which happened to be my father,
Ooh.
by saying, well, I just actually have enough faith that God could answer this question.
Oof. There it is. Because
And
you had faith like a child, which
yeah,
is always asking, always wondering.
absolutely.
Right.
And I think it's a sad state of things that something that we call faith, we try to give answers to,
Yes. Yes. Right.
right? Because that's the opposite of faith. So if you answer my question about faith, then it's no longer faith, it's certainty.
There you go. Right.
And what we should be doing as pastors, as leaders in faith communities, and honestly, I would argue this for all of the world, regardless of faith or not. We should be helping people learn to ask the next better question, not help people answer a question right now. Like,
Yes.
if someone asks a question, I think we do them a bigger favor. We do them a larger service if we teach them, okay, that's a great first question.
Mm.
What is the next question that you want to ask
Yes.
that leads you further on this journey?
Yeah, that's so solid. And that is discipleship, right? Essentially is just like these, you're looking to someone who has walked a little bit longer, maybe than you have in some way in a particular direction. Make it some other topic other than faith, right? It could be anything, right? It's that you're looking to somebody and you're asking questions. They're asking questions of you more so than they're always telling you the answers.
Yes.
That to me is a lot more interesting than here's what you need to know. Make sure you check those things off. It's like when you go for ordination, which I'm not sure you were allowed to because you don't have
I,
the
I was found not worthy.
not worthy, not because you're not knowledgeable enough, but because you don't have degrees, correct? Am I right about that?
Yeah, I did not have the agreed upon certification from
Yeah.
others.
Which is that could be a whole nother conversation, which next time you're on the
Absolutely.
podcast, we'll talk about. But
Wonderful.
yeah, but you definitely had the knowledge, but in order to get ordained, you have to be able to say, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. And you have to, and in some traditions, it's a lot more rigid. Within the one that we were both a part of, there was a little bit of wiggle room because they were
Right.
Swedish, but but in other traditions, it's check this box, which is just insufficient as you become an older person and certainty no
Yeah.
longer works in this world.
So I do want to say something to your question about, like, discipleship, like kind of defining it.
Please.
I think that there's a really interesting differentiation to be made between being a student and being a disciple.
Mm,
And so, in this idea of being a student, you want knowledge, you want information,
yeah,
right? So if I was so you are my teacher, you happen to teach, right?
I
So
do.
you teach civics, correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So if I was sitting in your class, I'd want your knowledge of civics. If I was a disciple in your class, I would want to know how you put together your teaching.
Mm,
I'd want to know how you came to your conclusions. I would want to know what you ate for breakfast that
mm,
put you in a place that you were willing to take extra questions that day. I'd want to know how you respond to actual civics in the real world.
yeah.
And I would want all of that because I'd want your wisdom. I want to be Dave Capozzi.
Yeah, right.
And the difference between a student is they want the information, and a disciple wants to be the teacher.
Yeah.
They want to emulate them in every possible way.
Yeah.
One, that takes a certain amount of arrogance to say, I'm going to disciple you, because that implies that people want to be like you.
Yeah.
But in the other sense, it also is humbling to recognize that I might be capable of giving good answers.
Yeah.
But if someone investigates my life, they might see something different. And so I'm passionate about discipleship at church. I'm passionate about that level of mentoring. I think we see that probably like I think most of us have seen that at least within like martial arts movies and stuff, where like a sensei and I might not even be using the proper terminology, and the student is going beyond just learning the technique,
Yeah.
but they want everything from their teacher.
Yes.
And I just think that the church doesn't offer that.
No. No, it doesn't.
In fact, we would rather make our pastor a celebrity pastor who is untouchable and out of the reach of people.
Yes.
And to me, that is a disaster. And I think that's part of the reason we've ended up where we are.
Don, that's such an interesting assessment. I do think you're right. We not only do we not offer it, it is discouraged, because a pastor's job is to impart, is not even teacher. It's, I prepare something for you once a week. I'll throw that at you. Go
Yep.
about your week. Let's do this again. And
Yep.
it's performance. It's it's a consumeristic thing that's just a part of the American narrative, right? And not only, it's one thing if we just do it to ourselves, but we have spread that consumer thing about the Christian tradition all across the world.
Yes.
So it's like, I impart my thing on you and you receive it, and I'm going to go home and watch the football game.
We read the Great Commission as now go and colonize the nations, as opposed to go and disciple the nations.
Yeah, there it is. So if you're like, colonization allows for, oh, this is interesting, right? So colonization is like, you go, you take over, you subjugate, and actually you take stuff from that culture. You end up,
Absolutely.
you know, discipleship is not like a subjugation, it's an invitation, right? It's yeah, there's there's no power over there.
No, in fact, if you look at discipleship in the way that I think we see done historically in ancient times, it's more about empowering individual people to become the fullest expression of themselves in the case of like Jesus, or within Jewish mindset in Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism. It's for that person to become the fullest expression of God in that they can become and that they can learn. So like when I think about discipling people, the last thing I ever want to do is create a bunch of mini Dons.
Yeah.
Right. That's the last thing the world wants. And so instead, it's trying to help people to understand why they believe what they believe.
Yeah.
Because I think most of us have an idea of how we want to live in the world, right? So, and again, I think that this transcends faith, in my opinion, but I might be naive. But we all have a way we want to behave in the world.
Yeah.
And then we all have beliefs about how we should behave in the world. And rarely does our belief and our behave align.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. Right. So we might say, oh, I want to be uninterruptible. That was something I wanted, because one time I read a book by Abraham Heschel's daughter, an intro, and she said, my dad, I could never interrupt him. No matter what he was doing, he welcomed me into the space. And I never felt like I was interrupting him, no matter what he was doing. So I was like, that's me. I'm going to be uninterruptible.
I love that.
Yeah. My belief and behave do not line up. I am like, shut the door. I'm on a call.
Leave me alone. Right.
Um, and part of it's because I didn't know why I believed I wanted that. Right. And if I understood more deeply what it was about creating an atmosphere that people didn't perceive that what they were doing was interrupting me,
Yeah.
even if it was, if I understood what the value of that was
Yeah.
and what the meaningfulness of that was, I would be much more likely to behave it closer to my belief than I do if I don't understand.
Oh,
And it's think about children, right? You know, you have a child, they're 3, 4 years old, throw a block across the living room, and you're like, don't do that. And the kid's like, why? Because I said so.
right.
Well, that's only compelling as long as you're standing in the room.
Mm-hmm.
That's no longer compelling.
Mm-hmm.
But if the child understands, and this is the key, understands, right?
Yeah.
Depending on
Yeah.
how young the child is, they might not, but
Right.
understands that throwing the block might break the TV that they love.
Yeah.
It might break the block that they love.
Yeah.
Um, that the outcome, not punishment, that's fear,
Yes.
right? Not the
Yes.
punishment that comes, but instead the outcome, the unintended consequences of their behavior,
Yeah.
what might come of that, then you're more likely to get a response that the child will be like, okay, well, then it doesn't make sense for me to throw this block in this room.
Right. Then they've come to
And I
that.
realize that that's oversimplified,
No, no,
but
that's very helpful though. And I think that that whole disconnect between the believe and the behave is something that we've been confronted with over and over and over again, which is part of that thing that you were describing of the celebrity person that is going to let us down because it's
they
about
have no
belief.
choice but to. It's not
Exactly.
fair to them.
Exactly. But you were talking about how the world doesn't need more Don Sheevers, which could be your uh, humility speaking. It could also be your insecurity speaking, and I wonder if you can talk to that a little bit, because one of the things I know well about you, and that you and I actually have talked about often, is you suck at self promotion.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that comes from a childhood thing that we internalized about, it's all about God, it's not about us. If it's like we watch the celebrity pastor and we're like, I don't want to be that. But you have something of value that I would say, and many others that have been discipled by you would say, that the world needs desperately. But you have something about not you struggle with that, putting yourself out there in a way that's like, hey, I have something to offer. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on where that comes from, or what's going on there for you?
So I think there's a handful of things going on. One is something that a lot of us deal with, which is just imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
right? You know, it's you can convince yourself that the people surrounding you are just kind and they're being nice to you. They're being polite. You're on their podcast. They have to say nice things about you. Um, and so you can become convinced that what it is that you're receiving, the inputs that you're receiving of your value are not accurate. They're distorted in some way. So I think that's a key that a lot of people, I think for me particularly, there's a handful of things that are very specific to me. I grew up in an abusive, physically and sexually abusive household
Yeah.
growing up.
Yeah.
I was told at a young age many times that if it wasn't for the clothes on your back, you wouldn't be worth the shit in the sewer. And so, in my mind, there is a part of this that is, people are just being nice. People are being polite.
Hmm.
I think the other thing that is it's interesting, and this is actually a new thing for me, is that so there's a great book that came out, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago called Words on the Move. It might not even be that old. And it's about how words have changed throughout history.
Yeah.
So like what began as one word changes, evolves over time and has a different meaning. It's what we all get mad about. Like, does bad when Michael Jackson use it mean good? Right? Showing my age, right? So like, so it's but when the dictionary was written, when Webster wrote down and recorded the meaning of words,
Hmm.
it froze words that prior to that, there wasn't, it was expected that word would evolve. it wasn't until it was recorded that people started saying, hey, these words shouldn't change.
Yeah.
They should be frozen in time.
Right.
It's recent that I realized that I think that's some of my own trepidation
Mm.
about self-promotion or putting myself out there, is that the words I say, for instance, on this podcast right now, the words I say are going to be frozen. As long
Yes.
as this podcast is available someplace, somewhere, what Don Schiewer said on this day is
Yes.
stuck in that place.
Yes.
Regardless of whether Don has evolved, regardless of whether
Yeah.
Don has changed, as I hope that I would, right?
Right.
I hope that tomorrow I disagree with many things I believe today. Um, and because of that, there's a fear of putting yourself out in that space where you get stuck, like it becomes a frozen piece of history.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's really disconcerting to me.
Yeah.
And I haven't completely figured out how to overcome that, because I value change.
Yes.
Like, one of my favorite things that a rabbi said, and I wish I remember the rabbi's name offhand, said was, if you worship the same God today as you did yesterday, you're worshiping an idol.
Mm-hmm. That's so good.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I feel that. And I want my interpretation of scripture. I want my exegesis of my neighborhood. I want my evaluation and hermeneutics of society to change every day.
Yeah. I love that, Don.
And so there's a fear of being stuck.
That's so interesting.
There's a saying about, like, the idea, and this is about, like, gossip, but it still works and it resonates with me, is that someone went to a teacher, I think in the story that I read, it was a rabbi, and said, I said some things about someone that weren't true. I want to seek forgiveness. And the rabbi said, okay, take a feather pillow and go up on top of that hill, dump out the feathers and bring me the pillowcase. So the person does that and comes back with the pillowcase. And the rabbi says, and the person says, okay, now what? Now what? And the teacher, the rabbi, says, now go get all the feathers.
What a joke.
And right, but also just a really powerful teaching
It
of the
is.
way that when we say things,
Yes.
that they're no longer ours. We no longer own the words,
Mm.
and they are out there and they flutter about and they land where they will.
Mm.
And we need to be very careful about the way that we talk.
That's a
And
really, really powerful message. It's also applicable to what we read from the past, correct? Because if you're reading something from 2000 years ago, to imagine what those people might be saying had they had more time to speak, or
right,
or if they
they
were,
had a redo.
or if they were around today.
Yeah,
And that's
I'd
why.
like for Paul to rewrite a couple of his letters.
Me too.
Yeah.
So, so I have a question because people have heard now you talk about what I referred to a little bit earlier on, that you have this love and appreciation and for, and you articulate um, things about Torah and about the Hebrew Bible and about Second Temple Judaism in a way that you don't often hear Christians talking about. And so you've now
Yeah.
you've started this new, you have a podcast, you're on YouTube streaming. The podcast is called Ancient Jesus Future Faith, correct?
Yep.
Can you explain the meaning around that and sort of what you're going for with that conversation or that title?
Yeah. So I was fortunate to have a couple people that wouldn't accept my desire to stay in the background, and they kind of gave me a loving nudge in front of this train called social media.
Beautiful.
And so I guess the main idea that I think that evangelicalism is kind of missing or lacking is that when we get to Constantine in church history, that's where most people's understanding of Christianity begins.
Yes.
And Constantine is not Jewish. Constantine is not impacted by Judaism at all, other than he was overseeing the oppression of the Jewish people,
Right.
As he was overseeing the oppression of many different people groups.
Right.
And so, but with Constantine, and maybe even slightly before with Irenaeus, we see Gentile leaders start to, and by Gentile, I mean European white leadership, like Rome, etc., Greeks, Romans, start to take over the leadership of this faith called Christianity, which at the time of Irenaeus was, I still believe, was still considered a sect of Judaism. It
Yeah.
hadn't fully split. And so Irenaeus is a good example. I think 200 CE in the second century is already, if you interpreted something that wasn't, you didn't interpret it through an allegory, therefore taking something physical and making it spiritual, kind of like salvation, which I would argue salvation is about the physical safety of people.
Right.
And Irenaeus is interpreting as a spiritual salvation. That if you weren't interpreting things as allegory and spiritual, then you were interpreting it like the Jews and interpreting it physically. And of course, that's said with derision, and that's said with anti-Semitism. And so what ends up happening is Platonism has really creeped into the thinking, because you have all these Greek and Roman thinkers who have been greatly influenced, raised in the Greek education process, that Platonism was rampant, was the main philosophy.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you start having all these Gentiles coming in leadership and pushing out Jewish leadership. And now not only have they pushed out Jewish leadership, interpretation by Jewish people or a Jewish way of interpreting the text becomes a negative and becomes a slanderous concept.
Yes.
And everything is moved from being physical to spiritual, because if you're the emperor, you don't need saved from anything physically.
No.
Right.
Exactly.
In fact, I would say weakness.
Right.
So the only thing Constantine is happy with being saved from is evil. And so now all of a sudden everything switches to spiritual as opposed to physical. So Tyrios no longer means safety.
Yeah.
It means saved from death and sin.
Yes. And do we can thank Augustine for a bit of that as well, right?
Well, Augustine puts the lid on it.
He's the theologian of the empire that people still quote pretty regularly to this day. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I would say, ancient Jesus, future faith, the ancient Jesus part is a pre-Constantinian Christianity.
Yeah.
So not to say that nobody post Constantine, or maybe more specific, post Irenaeus, has nothing good to say or contribute to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
But that we need to be conscientious and check it through the lens of what existed in Second Temple Judaism at the time, what fit their understanding, their interpretation of the scriptures.
Yeah.
And so that is the ancient Jesus piece of it. The future faith piece of it is that evangelicalism is so steeped in Platonistic and Marcionism. Marcionism being that the God of the New Testament is gracious and kind and loving, and the God of the Old Testament is angry and judgmental, and, you know, in fact, two separate gods.
Yes.
Right. And we'll still hear that echoed in our churches. Maybe
Absolutely.
not that plainly, but we'll hear like, oh, the God of the Old Testament was angry. And as my brother always says, and then God had a kid and became a big softie. Right.
But he had to kill the kid to become a softie.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want to ruin your reputation.
Right.
So if you recognize that this Marcion, this Platonistic thinking about Christianity would have been extraordinarily foreign to the first 200 years of Christianity.
Yes.
Then I think that there's room for us to say there's something broken about that. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But what happens if we consider the teachings of Second Temple Judaism as the baseline.
Yeah.
We consider the teachings prior to Irenaeus, but definitely prior to Constantine, as more authoritative. We're going to find that there's a lot less misogyny. There's a lot less, harmful language used.
Yeah,
And
for
it's
sure.
much more physical. And I think what the world is missing right now is the physicality of Christianity.
Mm.
Christianity is a faith of thoughts and prayers instead of feet and hands.
Oof.
And that is heart-wrenching to me.
Yeah.
And it should be an offense to everyone that calls themselves a Christian.
Mm.
Because if we don't pray with our feet, if we don't forgive with our hands, if we don't seek justice with our fists, if we don't fight against harm with our legs, right? Was it Frederick Douglass said, I prayed for 20 years and then finally I prayed with my legs,
Mm.
right? As he ran from slavery.
Yes.
This is and Heschel is famous for saying, I prayed with my feet when he was asked why he went to Selma to march with MLK. Because he said,
Yes.
sometimes you pray on your knees, sometimes you pray beside your bed, and other times you pray with your feet.
Mm.
And I think that unless Christianity learns how to read the text less spiritually and more physically, we will only be. I just used this reference the other day, and forgive me if it's strong, because it is strong. Christianity, I think there's two good examples.
Yeah.
You have 9/11,
Yeah.
where you had first responders who are willing to give up their own safety, their own soterios, their own salvation, right, to run into the burning inferno to rescue people and pull them out of collapsing towers. Because in their minds, they lived in fear and trembling, but believed that the soterios, the salvation, was important. And so they, with fear and trembling, ran into the buildings and brought salvation or safety to the people that were about to lose their lives.
Yes.
And they risked their own lives to do it. That's a powerful picture, in my opinion. And often, most of the time, that is first responders' behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Today, evangelicalism is Uvalde,
Mm.
where we all the first responders, knowing that the safety of the people inside are dependent on our fear and trembling of our own safety, to run in and grab hold of them and pull them out.
Mm.
But instead we give them prayers and thoughts, because we do not have a physicality to our faith.
Brother. Man, that's it.
If Christianity, if those of faith could actually imagine pursuing a faith that is pre-Constantinian, therefore against empire, not in bed with it, and is seeking the justice, mercy, and salvation, soterios, of the people that are harmed by empire, that would be meaningful again. It would actually be of value.
Yeah, I believe that to be true, and that's something that I've been wrestling with myself as I search out what faith means post religion. You know,
Yeah.
because I have decidedly for myself left, and I don't know what it means now because I'm not an atheist. I'm a person of faith, which I take to mean I'm a person of wonder. I wonder,
Yep.
and I believe in justice and mercy, and want to pursue that alongside other people. To me, that's faith, right? We're in
Yeah.
pursuit. We're in pursuit of that. Uh, and so I wonder now, what does that mean? Because I can't go back. I can't go back to any of the things
Or should you?
that I know are based on Constantinian Christianity. I can't do that. And
Yep.
yet, to me, as much as we know and love so many people within those traditions, which we do, right? We have dear friends. We love people that have walked with us that are still part of those traditions. I can't do it. I can't be part of it. And so now I wonder, because I know a community is essential for faith. I don't know what that means. I'm left wondering.